Gnosi seauton. The problem of self-knowledge. What is self-knowledge? What does it mean to know yourself? Gnosi seauton reads the old inscription on the temple of Apollo in Delphi. What is meant by that? Plato and Aristotle tell us that what is meant is essentially that the highest knowledge, the most important knowledge, is knowledge of the soul. But then again, what does it mean to know the soul? What is a soul? What is the relationship between knowledge and the soul? Is the soul something in the world, just as a table is, or a hand? How does that differ? Well, Aristotle goes further into this, and it turns out that the soul is ultimately thought, thinking. Noesis noesios. Thought, thinking, implying thinking itself. There is a kind of circularity here, a spiritual movement that is unlike all other kinds of movements, what we would call perhaps physical movement, right, which goes from point A to B, and of course can be recurrent, as the sun that we see coming up and down, going down and then setting, right, and then rising again, as the seasons. But this is not yet, not quite, circular in the sense that thought, thinking is circular. Spiritual movement, the movement that Aristotle is referring to here, is unending, without beginning, but it is also instantaneous, direct, unmediated. To know yourself, for Aristotle, will mean to know the soul, but this soul turns out to be on a journey. This journey leads to the roots, the spiritual roots, well, of the soul, but the soul is spiritual, of course. So the soul is fallen into a world that is alien to it, that it sees as alien. The soul is an alien. What might say today, an illegal alien. No, he is a legal alien in the sense that there is no law that forbids him from being here. And yet he is, as Christianity tells us, the Gospels, he is in this world, but not of this world. And so, gnosi seauton, know yourself, know thyself, will suggest here that you are to journey back to the place where you truly are yourself, not alienated, but you are at home. So self-knowledge is about returning, is about journeying back to where you belong, the place where you are truly at home. It's perhaps worthwhile recalling that Shakespeare draws a distinctive difference, right, between a house and a home. So people go to their house, but it's not quite their home. And so some characters are seeking home. This home turns out to be the place of fulfillment of all desire. We talk about nostalgia sometimes, right? So it is this pain for, right, this longing, painful longing for home. And we're all longing for something. What are we longing for? Satisfaction. We're longing for a return to where we truly belong. Not in this world insofar as we are somewhat lost within it. We seek a world in which we can be truly in communion with all things. This is not possible as long as we are lost in the world, as long as we do not reach out to the borders, the limits of our world. But our world, does it have a limit? Does it have a boundary? Well, the boundary is somewhat as the boundary of a dream. So it recedes all the time. And of course, in modern so-called scientific discourse, we have an expanding universe, we have the alternatives, but in any case, everything disappears as we move forward toward the so-called boundaries. But then again, if there were a boundary, what would be beyond it? In Aristotle's terms, of course, for those who are familiar with him, there are no actual physical boundaries to the universe. There are only hypothetical ones. In reality, the universe must be contained by something that is not physical. So the absolute, actual boundaries of the universe are defined by thought, thinking, thought. In other words, God, as he puts it, O Theos. All right, so gnosi seauton, know thyself. How are we to know ourselves? Let us have a little parenthesis here for the way this call, this injunction, this proposition is read in the modern world. Well, in the modern world, we have all kinds of people who claim to know themselves or to claim to be able to tell you what it means to know yourself. We have, for instance, psychology. Psychology tells you, well, following Descartes, one way or another, tells you, and so if it follows Descartes, it follows Machiavelli. And so we have a secular self or ego that we need to deconstruct and analyze, and then we can, on the basis of our analysis, we can come to some kind of reconciliation, or what is it that they call it? Adapting or integration. There you have it. We can be integrated in our society, in our world. We can be at home in our world. We don't need to be alienated from our world. There is no reference here to another world. It's just a matter of being at home in our world. Now, this in traditional classical discourse is absurd. You cannot be at home in this world. Truly, you can only pretend to be. But pretension is incompatible with self-knowledge. Now, one could also say that scientifically, self-knowledge refers to knowledge of the structures of, well, identity. So you have sociologists who consider how the self is constructed by society. We have linguists who say, well, let's look at how language structures, defines who we are. Let us further look at, well, we can have the neurologists or the neurobiologists who look at how the brain, right, is influenced by external forces to react to them, right? And produce our consciousness, right? So in this case, Aristotle is out of the window, of course, because thought, thinking itself, irreducible thought, in other words, is reduced to, well, it's an epiphenomenon, a result of, well, these mechanisms, right? Neurological, all of this stuff moving around, little tiny billiard balls bumping into each other, electrical impulses reacting to the external forces of the universe to produce, well, a kind of neurological excrement, which is thought. And so, to know yourself means to analyze, study, categorize, and potentially manipulate the forces that produce our thought. And so we have here essentially a development from the early modern thinkers, right, such as Immanuel Kant, who, of course, well, again, for those familiar with him, rejects entirely the possibility of knowing purely, reflectively, the foundation of our will, of our freedom. What does this have to do with, well, with the question of self-knowledge? Well, the point is that for Kant, you must move forward. There is no purely reflective turn. There is no Aristotelian God, of course. To know yourself is possible, self-knowledge is possible through the exercise of modern science. In other words, we look at the structures of consciousness. Neuroscience has not yet been invented, so we're simply considering a kind of phenomenology of human experience and the modes of conceptualizing things. And so we have a kind of grid, a posteriori, a priori concepts, synthetic, and so forth and so on. Now, analytic. Now, what does this mean? It means that we can establish order. We have a method, and we can order our lives. And as we order our lives, we begin to understand our destiny. And who and what we are will be fully disclosed at the end of our work, which will necessarily have to be collective. The fulfillment of our destiny in a kingdom of ends will allow for full self-knowledge. This has precious little to do with the ancient call to self-knowledge, which is not a call to know a thing, right? Or to begin by analyzing a clock, whether it has a maker or not is irrelevant. To break it apart, right? And to see what the pieces are and then try to reconstruct it. And in reconstructing it, we know it. Now we know it. No. We could say that self-knowledge has, in the classical sense, has a kind of mystical character to it. For it involves a turn, a kind of conversion of life in a reflective mode. We're no longer seeking possession of objects of knowledge. Right? We're not trying to reduce objects to a finite thought, but we're trying to discover things in an infinite thought that things presuppose, or rather an indefinite, a non-defined thought or mind that things presuppose. Now, this is a great challenge, and the fathers of the modern world say, no, this challenge is not for everyone, and we are looking for something that is for everyone. Everyone can know himself. Even if you're a bad person, you can know yourself. But the ancients say, no, only a good man can know himself. Or rather, the good man is the man who is devoted to discovering who he is. Now, this raises a problem. The distinction between what we are and who we are. Now, in the modern case, we can figure out what we are preliminarily. Analysis. On the basis of our study, of our examination, of our analysis, of what makes us, right, what influences us, we can build our identity. We could say, choose who we are, right? We can be characters who define themselves, who become their authors. Because they have gained a kind of power, and knowledge is power here, over that which makes them. In the classical sense, however, who we are ultimately is inseparable from what we are. Who we are, we could say as conscious identities. Who we are is a problem seated at the heart of what we are. So what we are is not simply quantifiable. There is something pervasively unquantifiable about what we are. Now, in the modern context, we sort of pragmatically pretend that what we are is quantifiable, but that's just a preliminary, provisional move, we might say, moving towards a transformation. Everything is evolving, we're told, after all. And so what we are is evolving. But we treat what we are provisionally as quantifiable in order to seek our identity. And then it turns out that our identity is fully disclosed in a world in which everything is absolutely quantifiable. The technocratic society. Everything is digitalized, compartmentalized, historicized. Everything has a little place for it. It's been given a place. To understand means to contextualize, to frame. And so we're in the business of intellectual scholars, universities. We're all in the business of framing, of finding a place for this thought, this word, this person, this writer, this author, this movement, right? And so forth. Everything has its place. The digitalizing of the world must move forward towards a digital world. Only therein will we be able to figure out fully who we are. Because then what we are will be mastered completely. Never mind how things used to be. Right? In a world that is not digital, we cannot know what we are, and therefore we cannot be truly free. We cannot be truly ourselves. In other words, know who we are. But of course, none of this makes sense in a classical sense. This is all rubbish, garbage, trash, delusion, delusions of grandeur. And so what do we have instead? Well, we have a search for identity seated in a what. This what is not simply quantifiable, but we have to deal with the unquantifiable within the quantifiable. Without a universal, mathematical, symbolic, scientific method, so what do? How do you live? Well, we're dealing here with the poetic life, a life of moderation, of the passions, life of, as was once called, life of virtue, and ultimately, we're speaking of a life of return to sources, a reflective turn, life in the mode of reflection, a turning back. So there is no progressive drive toward unlimited success, gain, power, but rather a moderation in everything we do, a moderation that involves, of course, the cultivation of strength of mind, and everything that depends upon it in a positive way. But this is not the point. The point is returning to a truth through the threshold of death. The classical poetic life is a life that is fundamentally contemplative. It does not seek to escape from violent or avoidable death. It faces it. So we don't have the rampant development of medication, right? Medication industry, right? All things in moderation, all practical things in moderation, for the sake of returning to that which is unlimited. Know yourself is the greatest challenge for us. Schools are no longer at all in touch with this challenge. They distract us from it. Well, they feed us into a digital world. They treat us as expendable numbers. So, returning to pre-modern classics, books, will be quite helpful. We need all the help we can get. Acknowledging that we're lost in a world of compulsion. Not enough to go to analysis, to Alcoholics Anonymous. Not enough to study neurobiology or neurology or computer science. This is all an obscurantist distraction with respect to the challenge of, the classical challenge of self-knowledge. Well, what about prayer. What is that? Openness to the understanding, to the disclosure of that which is, of the divine. Know yourself. No. You cannot know yourself in, as we say, an objective manner, in the sense that you are not reducible to a quantity. Your identity. Well, can I not choose it however I feel like? No, because your true identity, of course, you can make up any kind of face. In Hamlet, we have this rejection of fake faces in favor of a divine given, God-given face. So, who am I in God's eyes? Now, I don't really care what I am in God's eyes as much as I care about who I am in God's eyes. In other words, what I care about is what is alive, not what is dead. And yet, if I were to seek simply who I am, aside from the consideration of what I am, I'd be dreaming about being Napoleon, so to speak, or being a frog, a dog, a donkey, a fish. That's delusion, again. In a passage from Dante's Paradiso, there is a guy who dreams about being a god and then ends up finding himself as a fish. He's just a little fish. So who we are, the problem of who we are, is necessarily tied to the problem of what we are, and yet not in the modern sense, as we've considered. So we're looking at the what, not in the modern way, but as a mystery, really, as that which is. So the classical term is being, as that which is. It is. It simply is. The table is. It's mysteriously. It is in a mysterious context. And by caring for that which is, so through care, through a kind of openness, pious openness, to see what is actually there, we begin to see all that is there as a reflection of that which is fundamentally, of its source, one could say, of that which sustains it, of the fundamental boundary of the thing. That fundamental boundary in Greek is called eidos, the hidden form of things, not just a morphe, some kind of the shifting semblance, an appearance, but a form that is alive, that is at work in things, and that is fundamentally responsible for the development of things. So to know myself as something, so to know what I am, really, is to return to a living substance. And that is precisely what Aristotle will call God.